My old house. I don't usually share stories like this, but after reading the eerie experiences of others in this group, I finally feel comfortable enough to share mine. 6 years ago, 15 years after purchasing my home, my wife invited an old friend over, someone she hadn't seen in years. As they caught up, her friend suddenly remarked that there were multiple spirits in the house. Apparently, she considered herself sensitive to such things. Without hesitation, she attempted to contact the two female spirits she claimed were present. That was when everything changed. 2 weeks later, I came home from my shift at work. As I stepped into the kitchen, I heard what I assumed was my wife moving around upstairs. Soft footsteps echoed through the ceiling, then silence. A few moments later, I heard it again, but this time, the footsteps were heavier, more deliberate, almost stomping. I called up the stairs, but no response. I stood still, listening. The air felt thick. The house seemed to be holding its breath. Then, the stomping returned, louder, angrier, followed by the sound of doors slamming. Heart pounding, I rushed up the stairs, expecting to find my wife. No one. Not only was the floor empty, but the silence that followed was unnatural. So still, I could hear my own breathing. And then, that feeling crept in. A deep, sinking dread, like I was being watched by something unseen. Something that did not belong. My instincts screamed at me to leave. Slowly, I backed toward the stairs, refusing to turn my back to the empty hallway. Step by step, I descended sideways, keeping my eyes locked on the upper floor. I had barely made it back to the kitchen when the entire house erupted. The ceiling above me trembled with a violent force. It sounded as if someone was furiously jumping, over and over again, slamming their full weight into the floorboards with inhuman strength. I ran. I left that house, and from that night on, it was never the same. The disturbances escalated. Doors slamming, whispers in the dark, shadows that moved where no light should cast them. The oppressive feeling of being watched became suffocating. It got to the point where we couldn't take it anymore. We sold the house. Our hotel room was already occupied. I prefer to stay in hotels and neighborhoods brimming with local character because I love immersing myself in the personality of a city. Over the years, I've stayed in dozens of historic hotels across Europe and the US, many of which claim to be haunted. While all were beautiful and some had an eerie charm, I had never experienced anything truly strange until a few months ago. In November 2024, my girlfriend and I traveled from the US to London, England. We chose to stay in Soho for its central location and unique atmosphere. Initially, we nearly booked a room at Mimi's Hotel, but then I stumbled upon a lesser-known spot just down the street, Harrington House. The moment I saw photos of its rooms, I knew we had to stay there. We checked in at 3 p.m. on a weekday. The lobby was quiet, suggesting we were among the few guests there at the time. Our overnight flight had taken 8 hours, so to recharge and adjust to the time difference, we decided to nap for a few hours before heading out to the pubs. Our room key simply read, Lord Edmund Whitmore. We climbed an old Georgian staircase and found the door bearing the same name. The lock clanked, the door creaked, and the floorboards groaned as we stepped into a small, Gothic vestibule, through another aged door, and into a fully wood-paneled room where centuries of paint had accumulated in thick globs over ornate moldings. The weak autumn sun, obscured by heavy silk curtains and a blanket of clouds, failed to adequately illuminate the space, so I switched on a lamp. The bedroom was small but filled with antique furnishings. Above the fireplace hung a painting of a stern-faced old man, his expression unsettling. My girlfriend undressed and climbed into the heavy oak bed, falling asleep almost instantly. I lingered in the bathroom, brushing my teeth and admiring the historical details. When I glanced back into the bedroom, something caught my eye. What followed lasted mere seconds, yet felt like an eternity. At first, I thought I was looking at another oil portrait. one I hadn't noticed before. Then I realized it wasn't framed. It wasn't a painting. It was a man. He stood near the corner of the bed, gazing down at my sleeping girlfriend. He appeared to be in his 30s, with medium-length wavy brown hair parted to the side, wearing a dark jacket with wide lapels. His expression wasn't hostile, just neutral, perhaps mildly curious, as though he had entered the room and was surprised to find someone there. The door had been locked. My first thought was that a hotel staff member had somehow entered. I was about to tell him the room was occupied when I realized there hadn't been a single sound of movement. This old hotel was creaky as hell. There was no way anyone could have entered silently. That's when I took a closer look at his clothing and hairstyle. The reason I had mistaken him for a painting was that he looked like someone straight out of a Regency-era portrait. His attire simple yet somber. My brain began piecing it together. A man I'd never seen before, standing in our locked room, dressed like he belonged to another century, had entered without making a sound. A cold wave of adrenaline surged through me. This couldn't be real. Holy shit, that's a ghost. I was in complete disbelief, caught entirely off guard. Ghost stories always spoke of apparitions appearing in the dead of night, not in the middle of the afternoon, let alone minutes after checking in. But he wasn't transparent, nor floating, nor glowing. He wasn't misty or ethereal. He looked as solid as any living person. He never spoke and never acknowledged me. His focus remained solely on my girlfriend. Yet, standing only 15 feet away with nothing but an open doorway between us, I felt an intense sense of exposure, as though a spotlight had been cast on me. I grew up in old houses, and this wasn't my first eerie experience, though it was my first in over a decade. I've learned not to give these things attention. I've always believed that acknowledging them only invites further interaction, so I pretended I hadn't seen him. Turning back to the sink, I continued brushing my teeth, letting the water run unnecessarily and noisily shifting our toiletries around. Anything to create sound. When I finally turned back toward the bedroom, he was gone. Stepping into the room, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. There was nowhere for a grown man to hide, yet he had vanished without a trace. Shaken, but determined to rationalize the experience, I told myself I was simply exhausted from the flight and seeing things. Despite my unease, I climbed into bed and, surprisingly, fell asleep. The rest of our trip was incredible. I even proposed, and we got engaged, but that's another story. Some might question my reaction, but what was I supposed to do? Scream and throw my toothbrush at him? Wake my girlfriend and risk looking insane? Jump out the window and become a ghost myself? Run into the hallway half-dressed, only to be laughed at by the hotel staff? The room was already paid for, and finding another place in central London without breaking the bank would have been nearly impossible. My best option was to ignore it and hope it left us alone. According to legend, the hotel is supposedly haunted by a writer who died in the building, hence its name, Harrington House. I later found a portrait of the man in question, but he didn't much resemble the figure I saw, though I suppose it could have been him. The rooms were named after his contemporaries, explaining the name on our key, but I found little information on Lord Edmund Whitmore. I didn't tell my girlfriend what I had seen until we were on our flight back home. She exhaled in relief. Thank you for not telling me while we were still there. She hadn't noticed anything strange during our stay, and I never saw the figure again. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't wake up each night in that room, scanning the shadows, wondering if he had returned. My cat. Longtime lurker of the sub, first-time poster here. Please forgive any grammatical or language mistakes, as English is not my first language. Hello everyone. I'm a philosophy teacher living in Mexico City. I am half Mexican and half Italian, which will be relevant to the story I am about to tell. I don't drink alcohol or use drugs and have no history of mental illness. Back in 2017, I lived alone in the same house I do now, happy with my books and my two cats, a tuxedo cat named Gordita and Ronnie, a big Siamese kitty. One particular and sunny April morning, I was at work, but left early due to a workers' strike at the university where I teach. Some colleagues invited me for coffee to discuss the conflict, but I declined. The reason? I felt an urgent, almost inexplicable need to return home. It was an intuition, a force pushing me back, and it made me uneasy. I had only experienced this kind of strong gut feeling 2 or 3 times in my life, and it scared me how powerful and unexplainable it was. Feeling slightly distressed, I arrived at my apartment. As I pulled out my key and opened the door, I saw a tiny calico stray kitten in the hallway. She was very small, with a swollen ear and looking malnourished. I immediately approached her and said, "Hey sweetie, who are you? Are you hurt?" In the blink of an eye, she ran straight at me. Since my door was already open, she stormed into my apartment, dashing into the living room. What happened next left me in complete shock. I followed her, and she suddenly stopped, locking eyes with me. At that moment, I heard something, maybe a voice, maybe a message. I can't fully describe it, but it was a mix of broken Spanish and broken Italian, my 2 native languages. The translation would be, "This is my house, you are my mom." My stomach dropped. I felt like I was going crazy. I know the voice of my own inner monologue, and this was different. As strange as it sounds, I swear it was the kitten speaking to me telepathically. Seconds after this surreal moment, the kitten casually jumped onto the living room window ledge, ready to nap in the sun, as if she already knew it was going to be her favorite spot. My 2 other cats came to investigate, both looking at her with complete bewilderment. Cordita was curious, while Ronnie seemed utterly confused. Meanwhile, I sat down, still in shock over what I had just experienced. After calming myself down, I went out 2 hours later to buy kitten food and a new cat bed. I ran into a neighbor and told her what had happened. She told me she had seen the kitten earlier that morning, sniffing around and trying to get into my door. That was 8 years ago, and indeed, I became her mom. Her name is Pidokia, and I love her with all my heart. We share a deep connection. She follows me everywhere, and we are incredibly close. I haven't heard her voice again, but I feel like we communicate beyond words. I also believe she astral projects into my dreams. What would have happened if I hadn't come home early that day? Did I sense her presence in advance? Has anything similar happened with your fur babies? My ghost story. Bear with me. This is a long story. It began when I was 6 and lasted until I was 8. I lived in a house in a small town in Ohio with my mother, my 2 brothers, my mother's friend Tracy, her boyfriend Paul, and their 3 sons. That meant I was the only girl in a house with 5 boys. Since I was the only girl, I had my own room, while all the boys shared one. Every single night, without fail, I was jolted awake by the sound of a little boy screaming and crying, followed by a woman's hushed voice whispering, "Shh, almost done." You might assume it was one of the other boys and one of the adults comforting them, but it wasn't. After countless terrifying nights, I started sleeping with my mother. I still remember the first time I actually saw him, the little boy. One night, I was in my mother's bed when she got up to use the bathroom. That same night, I heard the familiar crying again, so I followed her. As we walked back from the bathroom, I glanced into an empty room, one that wasn't a bedroom, and there he was. A small, black silhouette of a little boy stood motionless, staring straight at us. I ignored it, refusing to acknowledge its presence, and hurried back to bed. Every night, I also heard the sound of a woman pacing the hallway, whispering. One particular night, I hid under my blanket, humming softly to myself, in an attempt to drown it out. Suddenly, a breathy voice whispered directly into my ear, "You're mine." That morning, I saw the little boy again. Lying awake in bed, I could see straight down the hallway. At the very end, where there was only a wall, the same shadowy figure emerged. From within the wall itself, and walked slowly down the hall, staring straight ahead. Each time the crying and screaming stopped, I noticed one thing. It always coincided with the early morning rumble of the passing train. Months passed, and everyone assumed I was just a scared little girl with an overactive imagination. No one else saw or heard anything. That is, until Paul, Tracy's boyfriend, spoke up. He admitted that whenever he was up late at night by himself, he would hear and see, in his words, sketchy shit. I can't recall every single incident, but these experiences haunted me for years. I tried to research the history of the house but found nothing. As a child, I thought it was simply spirits. Now, as an adult, I fear it was something far more sinister. A haunting in the attic. This is my mother's story, one she has told me for decades without a single deviation. My mom, a boomer born in 1947, grew up in a farmhouse in southern New Jersey after World War II. The house was old, pre-Revolutionary War old, and sat on roughly 20 acres in Camden County. It had been standing for centuries, its walls steeped in history, its bones creaking with the weight of time. But something else lingered there, something unseen. In the house lived my grandparents, my mom's older brother, my mom, and her younger brother, who was just a toddler at the time. My grandparents worked full-time, often preoccupied with daily responsibilities and looking after my youngest uncle. My mom's older brother was a teenager, consumed with cars and girls, barely paying attention to the strange occurrences in the house. That left my mother, an imaginative young girl, alone in the attic, her sanctuary, her playroom, and perhaps something else's domain. The attic was vast, dusty, and filled with forgotten relics of the past. But to my mother, it was a magical place. She would spend hours hosting elaborate tea parties with her dolls, chatting with them as though they were real. The wooden floor groaned under her movements, and the dim light filtering through the attic's small windows gave the space an eerie golden glow. She would play for hours, leaving everything scattered before heading downstairs, when called for chores or dinner. And then, the unsettling part. Each time she returned the next day, she would find everything eerily arranged. The dolls, which she had left haphazardly sprawled across the attic floor, were now neatly seated around the table. The tea set, which had been overturned in the chaos of play, was now perfectly arranged, as if awaiting guests. At first, she thought it was her mother, perhaps her grandmother, tidying up after her. But when she asked, they denied ever going up to the attic. Her brothers, notorious for their disinterest in her girly toys, scoffed at the idea of touching her dolls. She never felt threatened, but an undeniable sense of being watched settled over her whenever she was up there alone. Sometimes, she would hear soft shuffling noises when no one else was home, or the sound of tiny feet scurrying just out of sight. The old wooden floorboards would creak under the weight of something unseen. Though her family dismissed it as childhood imagination, my mother knew better. And to this day, she has never once changed or exaggerated the details of her experience. The house was pre-Revolutionary War and was torn down to make way for a mall in the early 60s. It was on roughly 20 acres in Camden County, NJ. But my mother still wonders who or what had been joining her for tea. The thing in my house. Hey guys, I made a post on here about a week ago about a mimic in my house, and ever since then, physical things have started happening. It feels like whatever it is, whatever I acknowledged, is growing stronger. Last Saturday, my mom and stepdad were in the living room watching TV when they heard a loud crash in the kitchen. It sounded like a pot had fallen. My stepdad got up to check, but when he entered the kitchen, everything was in its place, nothing had fallen. Just as he turned to leave, he heard humming directly behind him, but no one was there. Later that night, I was lying in bed when I heard something scratch against my bedroom window. 3 long, deliberate scrapes. I froze, listening. A few seconds passed, and then the same sound came from my other window. 3 slow scratches. It was as if something was deliberately trying to make its presence known. Yesterday, my stepdad was home alone and saw something. Our cat, Ghost, ironic name, right? Loves to sit outside what we call the playroom. He isn't allowed inside, but he watches the door like something fascinates him. My stepdad was in the living room when he suddenly heard the doorknob of the playroom turning. Our house is old, and the doorknob squeaked loudly when turned. He looked up just in time to see the door slowly creak open. Ghost may be smart, but he can't open doors. And then today, the same thing happened to me. I got sick last night, so I stayed home from school. When I woke up, I was the only one home. My sister was at school, my stepdad was at work, and my mom was out running errands. I got up and went to the kitchen to take some nausea medicine. My dog and cat followed me, hoping I was about to give them food. As I swallowed the pill, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning. Ghost bolted toward the playroom door. My heart pounded as I turned to look. Just like yesterday, the door had cracked open on its own. I shut it quickly and went straight back to my room, locking the door behind me. This isn't something that could be explained by a draft or an old house settling. And if you're thinking it might be the spirit of someone who used to live here, that's impossible. My family and my great-grandparents are the only ones who have ever lived in this house. So what the hell is it?